Episode 257. Rules need context. Why? Because I said so doesn't work in autism parenting. Well, hey, friend. Welcome back to another episode of the Not Your Average Autism Mom podcast. I am your host, Shannon Urquiola. And I will tell you, if my eyes look watery, it's because I just was like 5 minutes into recording this podcast and had a absolute choking fit. So had to stop and start over. So I'm hoping that that doesn't happen again. But I am really glad that you're here today. I want to start by just saying this right up front. If rules feel like a constant battle in your house, if you're exhausted from repeating yourself, if you find yourself thinking, why is this so hard when it seems so easy for other families? This episode is for you because here's the truth that so many of us were never told. Rules only work when they make sense to the person expected to follow them. And for many autistic kids, rules without context, they just don't land the way that we assume that they will. Most of us were raised with rules like don't talk back. That's inappropriate. You know better because I said so. And those rules relied on things that many kids on the spectrum don't automatically have. Things like unspoken social understanding, flexible interpretation and social intuition, and emotional regulation under pressure. So, when a rule is given without the why, the when, or the what happens next, it can feel random or unfair or confusing to kids like ours. Think about that. It's not them being defiant. It's not them being manipulative. It's just unclear and confusing to them. When we say things like, my child just doesn't listen, what we often are really saying is, I don't understand why this isn't clicking. And that disconnect can feel personal, even when it isn't, right? You feel like, what am I doing wrong that this isn't working? And, this part can be uncomfortable, but I just want to say it matters because many rules exist because they make life easier for us as adults. They make things quieter, faster, less awkward, more predictable. But our kids don't automatically value those same outcomes that we do. So when a rule exists without context, it feels like control to them instead of guidance, control without a reason, correction without clarity. And that's when resistance shows up. That's when you see pushback, not because your child wants to be difficult, but because the rule doesn't serve a purpose that they can see or understand. And let's talk about, something subtle but constant. Like your child asks a question, a big one, a repetitive one, or a very detailed one. And your response is not right now. But right now compared to when? So, context sounds like I can answer that when I'm done cooking. That will be in 5 minutes. Because without that, your child just hears, this matters to me, but I don't know when it'll matter to you. Right? And that uncertainty often leads to repeated questioning, increased anxiety, frustration that looks like persistence, which then gets labeled as they're not respecting boundaries. And let's talk about something else that maybe you'll recognize. Think about this. So let's talk about stimming for a minute. Your child is allowed to pace, hum, script, talk out loud at home. Well, then one day you're in a waiting room and suddenly the rule is stop. That's not okay here. But no one explained why it was okay at home and not in the waiting room. And from your child's perspective, the rule didn't change, the environment did. And no one gave them the map. So, what actually helps is explaining the difference out loud. So, you could say something like, at home, your body can move and you can make noise, but in waiting rooms, people are trying to relax. So, we use our quiet voices here. When we get back to the car, you can move your body again, right? Sometimes when you explain the why behind the change, the rule finally makes sense. And listen, I'm not here saying this will always work. It will not. But imagine if it did just 25% of the time. How great would that be, right? Or here's another one. Let's say that your child blurts something out in public. Instead of, that's not appropriate, maybe you say, remember, in public places, we keep some thoughts in our head. Or during a transition, instead of, you can't stop in the doorway, you say something like, doorways are for walking through. Let's move to the side. Same rule, just a different delivery. And this idea doesn't just apply to physical spaces. It shows up just as much in social situations too. And this one hits hard for a lot of us. Your child says something honest, right? We know what those are like. Not mean, not intended to hurt, just factual. And the response is, don't say that. That's rude. But what does rude actually mean? Without explanation, what your child probably hears is, my words are bad, but I don't know why. What helps might be slowing it down and being specific. That thought is okay to have, but saying it out loud can make someone feel embarrassed. When we're with friends or when we're out in public with people we don't know, we keep those thoughts inside. That's how you teach social understanding without piling on shame. Because think about it, they just don't have the filter that we have, right? I mean, I'm sure we all have thoughts that we don't say out loud. Well, our kids just don't have those filters. So it's our job to teach them that. And here's something else that comes up a lot. When you say it's time to stop, your child often hears, I have to stop this and I didn't see it coming. And in that moment, the rule doesn't feel reasonable. It feels abrupt to them. So what helps is giving their brain a little runway, a countdown, a visual, a reminder of what's coming. 5 more minutes, then we clean up. After that, you get your snack or whatever that looks like. And you didn't weaken the rule. You made it feel safer. And when rules feel safe, it's much easier for them to follow. And this is especially important when the rule is about safety. Think about things like staying close in parking lots, not touching hot objects, waiting before crossing the street. Well, we often assume that danger is obvious. But for many autistic kids, danger is just abstract unless they've experienced it themselves. So instead of just, stating the rule, it helps to explain the reason behind it. Cars can't stop fast. My job is to keep you safe. That's why we hold hands here. You're not trying to scare them. You're helping their brain understand why the rule exists. And this is where a lot of us get tripped up because once we've explained something once, we assume that it should just stick. Not because we're doing anything wrong, but because we're expecting typical processing in a neurodivergent brain. And when it doesn't, that's when frustration creeps in, right? So now let's talk about why the rule doesn't usually work. We say it when we're tired, when we've explained something before, when we feel like we're stuck on repeat. And I know that feeling deeply, trust me. This is one of the most common phrases that parents use, and one that honestly is the least effective in autism parenting. When you say, you know the rule, we're assuming three things are happening in our child's brain at the same time. Number one, that they can access the rule from memory. Number two, that they can apply it flexibly to this specific situation. And number three, that they can regulate their emotions enough to act on it all at the same time. That's a lot to ask, especially in moments of stress or excitement or overwhelm. And for many of our kids, that combination simply isn't available on demand, especially when emotions are high or environments change or expectations shift. For many autistic kids, rules don't live in the same mental filing cabinet that we expect them to. A lot of us assume that rules are kind of stored like a checklist. I learned it once, so I should be able to recall it anytime. But for many autistic kids, rules are stored more like individual snapshots, not just one general category. So there's this rule at home, and then there's this rule at school, and this rule when I'm calm, and there's this other rule with this person. And when the situation changes, even just a little bit, the rule doesn't automatically come with it. That's why saying, you know, the rule can feel confusing instead of, corrective. Their brain may honestly be thinking, which version of the rule are you talking about? So instead of saying, you know better, it helps to guide their memory. You could say something like, let's remember what happens in this situation. Just that small shift removes shame, and it helps their brain reconnect to the rule instead of feeling blamed for missing it. And this is where understanding what's happening inside their brain really matters. Because when your child is overwhelmed or angry or anxious or sensory overloaded or emotionally flooded, their brain shifts into survival mode. And survival mode does not prioritize logic, memory, or rule following. It prioritizes escape, comfort, predictability, shutdown. So when you say you know better in a hard moment, you're asking their brain to do something it literally can't do right then. And that's not defiance, that's biology. And there's another layer to this that's really important to understand, even when we don't mean it this way. When a child hears you know better, what many of them internalize is, I should be able to do this. Something must be wrong with me. I'm disappointing you. And once shame shows up, learning shuts down even more. A child who feels ashamed isn't thinking, let me fix this. They're thinking, I messed up again. And that doesn't build understanding, it builds fear of failure. And I know that's not what you want. So instead of assuming that they can pull the rule up on demand, it helps to meet them where they are in that moment. Rather than saying, you know the rule, you might try guiding their memory. Say something like, let's remember what we do here. Or this is one of those moments where the rule helps. Or let me remind you how this works. You're not saying you should know this by now. You're saying, I'm right here. Let me help. So, for example, if your child blurts something out in public, like we talked about earlier, instead of correcting with, you know, that's not appropriate, you might just say something like, remember, in public places, we keep some thoughts in our head. That small shift changes the whole tone. It cues the rule without adding the shame. And that's where learning happens. All right. I want to slow this part down a little bit because it matters. What works for one child may not work for another. What works today may not work next week. And what doesn't work now doesn't mean that it won't work in 6 months or a year. Development isn't linear. Brains grow, processing changes, understanding deepens. So if you've tried visual schedules before and they didn't stick, if social stories have flopped, if explanations felt pointless, that doesn't mean that you failed. It means that timing wasn't right yet. So let's talk about what you can do. A few approaches that go beyond the usual advice that moms hear over and over. First, sometimes it helps to flip the way we introduce a rule. So instead of starting with what they can't do, start with why the rule exists in the first place. Say something like, this helps people feel safe, or this helps your body stay calm. Because once the reason makes sense, the rule itself is much easier for them to hear. Another big one is separating the rule from the emotion of the moment. When our children are dysregulated, their brain is not in a place to learn or remember anything. And we've all been there trying to explain something while emotions are already high. In those moments, it's okay to focus on helping their body settle down first and just come back to the rule later. Say something like, we'll talk about this when your brain and body have calmed down. Or let's pause for a minute and we'll come back to this. Rules tend to land much better after regulation, not in the middle of chaos. And as kids get older, it can help to let them be part of the process instead of just on the receiving end of it. So ask questions like, what helps you remember this? What feels fair here? What should we do when this rule is hard to follow? It doesn't mean you're giving up control. It means you're building understanding together. And this leads to one area that so many of us struggle with, right? Personal space. This is a big one in our house, even now. And Jordan is 29. Personal space is a really abstract concept. And abstract rules are often the hardest for our kids to grasp. Saying something like, give people space, doesn't mean much on its own. What helps is talking through what that actually looks like in real life over time without pressure. So you might point things out like when someone steps back or when their body language changes, and explain what that means, not as a correction, but as information. It's not just, that way the rule isn't just words anymore. It starts to connect to real moments and real people and real experiences. And this is usually the part where you might start quietly recognizing yourself in these moments. So if you're listening right now and you're thinking, yep, I say you know better when I'm tired. Yep, I assume that they're ignoring the rule because we've talked about it before. Yep, I feel frustrated repeating myself over and over again. I want you to hear me. You are not failing. You are not being too soft, and your child is not choosing to forget. Your child isn't ignoring rules. They're trying to navigate a world full of expectations that are mostly invisible to them. And your job isn't to enforce harder. It's to explain a little clearer. That doesn't make you permissive or passive. It makes you responsive. Sometimes they just need a reminder in the moment, not because they don't know, but because their brain needs a little help finding it. And that doesn't mean they won't get there. It just means that they're getting there in their own way. And this is where a lot of us start being really hard on ourselves, because timing almost never feels ideal. You're trying to explain the rule when your child is already overwhelmed. And when that happens, their brain just isn't in a place to take anything in. Language processing drops, reasoning shuts down. So the rule doesn't stick. And later it can look like they didn't care or they weren't listening when really their brain just couldn't hold on to it in that moment. This is why it helps to think about when rules are taught, not just what the rule is, but when they are taught. Teaching rules when things are calm, talking them through before situations come up, and then revisiting them afterwards without punishment, without shame. Because remember, learning doesn't happen in survival mode, it happens when they feel safe. And there's another part of this that I want to talk about that can quietly trip all of us up, even when we're doing our best. Sometimes rules aren't as consistent as we think they are. A rule might be enforced when we're tired, when we're in public, when other people are watching, and then a little more relaxed when we're at home or it's just us. Your child notices that shift. Without an explanation, what they might take away from it is the rule just depends on mom's mood. What helps is being honest about why it feels different in different places. So you could say something like, this rule matters more in public because other people are affected. And that's not weakness. That's clarity on your part. And listen, mama, if your child struggles with rules, it doesn't mean they lack discipline. It doesn't mean they don't respect you. And it definitely doesn't mean that they aren't capable. More often than not, it simply means they need more information than most people. And that's not a flaw, that's a difference. And once you start looking at rules through this lens, something else usually becomes clear. And this is the part I really hope that you walk away with. Timing matters. And no, you're not late. So, a rule that didn't work at age 6 or 9 or even 12 might suddenly click at 14. Not because you finally explained it the right way, but because their brain was ready. What doesn't work now does not mean it won't work 6 months from now or a year from now. You did not fail. They weren't refusing. The timing just wasn't right yet. So don't ever write something off forever just because it hasn't landed yet. I hear moms say this all the time. I've explained this 100 times, and you are not wrong. But repetition doesn't mean it didn't work. It usually means their brain needed more reminders in more situations before it could stick. And that's not a parenting problem. That's a processing difference. And sometimes the reminder that finally lands is the one that happens at just the right moment, when emotional maturity has grown, when language has caught up, or when lived experience fills in those gaps. Rules need time. They need scaffolding. They need space to settle. And sometimes the very last piece, it just arrives later. And because this is a long game, it helps to think about how rules are supported over time. Not perfectly, just consistently. A few things that really do help. Sometimes it's as simple as narrating your own behavior out loud. I'm waiting my turn because someone else is talking. Or reminding them of a moment that didn't go well. Remember when this worked last time? Or remember when this didn't work last time? What did we talk about then? And sometimes it's just normalizing that learning isn't one and done. This rule is still hard. That's okay. we'll keep working on it. All of that takes the pressure off needing to get it right forever. And if your child needs reminders, it doesn't mean they weren't listening. It doesn't mean they don't care. And it doesn't mean that they aren't learning. It just means their brain needs a little help in the moment. And when you offer explanation instead of criticism, you're teaching in a way their nervous system can actually take in. Not lowering expectations, it's just making them reachable. Because rules aren't about control, they're about safety, connection, shared understanding. And when you lead with clarity instead of pressure, you're not being weak, you're being intentional. All right, my friends, if rules have felt exhausting in your home lately, I hope that this episode gave you a new lens, maybe a little relief, maybe a little patience, maybe permission to try again, even if something didn't work before. Your child is not broken, you're not doing it wrong, and progress doesn't run on a schedule in this life that we're living. It unfolds when understanding catches up with expectation. And here's what I know to be true: progress in autism parenting isn't about getting it right once, it's about staying open to what might work the next time and believing in what is possible. All right. As always, thank you for spending a little time with me today. Until next week, have a great week ahead. And remember, above all, you, mama, are doing amazing at this mom thing.